Welcome back, everyone. I'm the Bad Luck Gamer, and we're back with another build for Pathfinder 2e. A little later than I was intending. This is the second time I'm recording this video. Check the community post if you want to know what's going on. But today's build is going to be a very interesting one, as I thought I had done a Bard build before, where I was talking in the fighter video that I was just redoing some of the ones from the original player core for the new remaster, and I completely spaced on the fact that I didn't have a Bard build, which is pretty crazy considering how powerful Bard is on the battlefield. In fact, Bard is so good that even as a full spellcaster, this build barely uses any Bard spells whatsoever, and it's still a really good build. So the Vicious Songblade is a co-op battler build. And what I mean by this is your whole purpose is to pair up with one of your marshals in your team and to fight with them on the battlefield and enhance their abilities while also fighting back with your own weapon. It's a really, really fun build, and I hope you all enjoy. All right, so let's go ahead and start off with the ability scores. So what abilities are we going to be focusing on for this build? Well, the primary ability is going to still be our charisma. We're a predominantly, a charisma caster after all, so it's very important for when we do use spells to have a good charisma. It'll also benefit when we use any of our social skills like intimidation or like diplomacy if we're using Bon mot. Intimidation for demoralize, obviously. It's just important to have it as high as possible because in the end, we're still a bard, even if we're not going to be doing many of or a majority spell casting in combat. Now, our second one is going to be actually Dex, and this is for a good amount of reasons, but the biggest reason being it helps increase our survivability with having a higher reflex score. But in addition to that, we can use a finesse weapon, so we can use it for striking. And if we want to get the best AC we can possibly get without sacrificing our speed, because speed is very important, we're going to actually need Dex. So that being the case, Dex is very important. And our last skill we're going to be putting into is going to be Strength. And that's predominantly because we are still going to be using a martial weapon. And since we're not a Thief Racket Rogue, it's just going to help us do extra damage. Plus, athletics is actually pretty key to the build, and so having decent strength early on is actually going to be very important. And actually, in addition to these focuses for the build, we actually do need to start out with a somewhat specific spread, at least for these three here ability scores. So the spread I recommend is +3 charisma, +3 dex, +2 strength. And I know a lot of you out there are probably cringing at the lack of charisma, but the important thing for the build is not actually our charisma. It's mostly going to be our dex and our strength. So the charisma, again, you want to have it at least at a decent amount, but for this build, it's not going to be as important in combat, so it doesn't really need to be maxed out. Now, our starting off skills, we're going to want to be trained in athletics, and athletics is a core skill for the build because we're going to be in martial combat, and so that a lot of really good abilities that debuff enemies are going to be based around athletics. So having good athletics score is somewhat important, and I'll get to that reason why. But at least when you're starting out, you're going to want to focus on your athletics. Next is Intimidation, and this is another easy one. For a singular action, a Demoralize, plus all the really good Demoralize Intimidation-based feats are insanely good. I mean, the ability to just shout out and intimidate all enemies within a 30-foot emanation when we start a combat is actually very solid. So that being the case, Intimidation is just going to be very powerful, and it's going to work off of our Charisma, which, again, is going to be one of our key stats. So it's a very good skill to have. Acrobatics is the next one I'm going to recommend, and this is mostly for positioning purposes. Our key focus is to get into position to help out our martial battle buddy. So that being the case, Tumble Through, and if you're unfamiliar, Tumble Through is an action that lets you move half your speed, and you can move through enemy squares. will allow us to potentially get ourselves either into position easier or into position at all, because sometimes if the enemies all line up, you need someone to get through to start flanking with, and you're going to be that one for your team. And last but not least is crafting. You don't need a ton of crafting, but you will need like the alchemical crafting feats, not necessarily for the build, but crafting is something that you're going to want to do because you're not a full Marshal character, and you're going to make up a lot of the difference with items, which is something we'll get to in the build a lot later. But having a little bit of crafting just in your downtime days, allowing you to make things like alchemical potions, mutagens, all that kind of stuff, or just other items in general, is going to go a long way to help your survivability in combat. So that being the case, getting up to at least expert eventually is probably would be my recommendation. All right, so with all that out of the way, let's go ahead and talk about the bard stuff. So as a bard, our muse is going to be the warrior muse, and I think that'd be pretty obvious. But the warrior muse is very important for a lot of reasons. One, it has some of the really best feats for this kind of build, and second, martial performance is actually insanely good. So martial performance, if you're not aware, it allows you to, if you strike and deal damage to an enemy, if you have your Courageous Anthem or a couple other of your focus cantrips going, it will extend it for a round. And what this does is it allows us to, on our like every other turn when we're not using our Courageous Anthem, we are able to do pretty much whatever we want on our turn, which gives this build a lot of flexibility. So martial performance is really good, and it's something I'm going to, is the core of this build. So I'm only going to recommend Warrior Muse. You need Warrior Muse for this build. So all that said and done, let's go ahead and get into the feats. All right, at level 2, when we get our first feat, we're actually going to go into the Mauler Dedication, which is actually why we needed to have a minimum +2 to our strength, because that's the requirement to get into the Mauler Dedication. The Mauler Dedication is a dedication that focuses on the use of two-handed weapons and is for bullying the enemy. Predominantly, it's going to be what we're going to use to trip the enemy to make it easier for our allies to take the enemy down. The initial dedication really doesn't do a whole bunch for us. I mean, we already have martial weapon proficiency, so it's not a very big deal, but it will allow us to pick up some other feats later. So for now, it's just something that we're picking up for later prospects. So I'm not gonna say you're gonna struggle early game, but you're not gonna get anything actually really new until level 4. And speaking on level 4, at level 4, we're gonna get Courageous Advance. Now, Courageous Advance is a crazy good spell shape, and what you do is you spend an action to enhance your next use of Courageous Anthem. Courageous Anthem, if you're unfamiliar with Bard, gives all your allies a +1 to their attacks, a +1 to their damage, and a +1 to their saves against fear effects. So it's a really good buff, and it goes out in a 30-foot emanation around you, which is a pretty big size. Now, what this spell shape does is, I mean, obviously you can see here, what it allows us to do is we can make one of our, well, not make, we can allow one of our allies, hopefully our battle buddy, as a reaction to stride up to get into position. This is insanely good. And so your first turn is going to look like you're going to go out, or you're going to start your turn. You're going to use your Courageous Advance into Courageous Anthem, and your ally is going to stride, and then you're going to stride, and now you guys are instantly flanking the enemy. And so on your ally's turn, they're already going to be benefiting not only from your Courageous Anthem, which is giving them a +1 to hit, but you're going to be flanking the enemy, which means that their AC is going to be reduced by 2 as they're going to be off guard. So this one strategy alone, this one, maneuver, pretty much reduces an enemy's AC by 3, which is really strong. Now, again, it's -2 for off guard, +1 to your ally, but to make it easier and more concise, it's easier to think of it as either the enemy's AC is 3 lower or your ally's chance to hit is 3 higher. In any regard, that's pretty devastating, even for enemies that are, 3 levels above us. So this is where the core of the build really starts, is you get into position, and then you and your ally just go at it for, the rest of the combat. Either you're attacking or using Courageous Anthem to keep up the buff. Heck, you can even throw in the use of some of your spells as every other turn after you strike. So on the second turn, for instance, you would have to use Courageous Anthem again because it wasn't extended last turn. But you can then strike the enemy, and then you have another action. You can use it to feint the enemy if they move out of position, or you can use that to stride to keep the enemy in position. And then on the third turn, you have 3 actions to do whatever you want. Strike the enemy, use a spell, trip the enemy with your athletics, whatever. There's a lot of ways that this kind of opens up, and it gets more and more efficient as the build goes on. At level 6, we're going back into the Mauler Dedication to pick up Knockdown. Knockdown is an insanely good action for action economy-wise because what it allows us to do is we spend 2 actions, we make a strike, and if the strike hits, we can then make a trip on the enemy, but we don't get the minus to our map, multi-attack penalty if you're unfamiliar, as a part of the maneuver prevents us from suffering map until both of the attack actions are made. When the enemy is tripped, they're off guard to all your allies, and they have a -2 to attack unless they stand up. And if you have a fighter in your team or anyone with reactive strike, the act of standing up will trigger reactive strike, which will provide more opportunities to deal damage to our allies. So all that being the case, it's an insanely good action. And like I said, on our second turn now, after we've got up and flanked the enemy with our battle buddy, on the second turn, we do Courageous Anthem into Knockdown, and we get that buff to hit the enemy, so it makes it more likely that we are to hit the enemy. And then all we need to do is succeed on an athletics check if the enemy hopefully has a lower reflex to then knock them down and deal a fair amount of damage. In addition to that, in addition, now the enemy has to make a choice, wasting one of their actions to stand up. And it's a really, really good build. Like the build starts working already at level 4, but at level 6, we're really cooking with fire now, as anytime the enemy stands up, we have the opportunity to just do another courageous knockdown pretty much and keep the enemy firmly debuffed, not just for our battle buddy, but for the rest of the team as well. It's really solid. At level 8, we're going to be taking advantage of our knockdown by picking up Reflexive Courage. What Reflexive Courage does is, as long as Courageous Anthem is going on, we essentially get a better reactive strike than a fighter does, which is nuts. And how it's better is this also is triggered off of auditory effects. So any effects that the creature makes sound, there's a lot of howls, roars out there that this works on. In addition, demoralize, or a lot of other actions enemies typically do, we can use that as a part of our reactive strike. So we actually get a lot of opportunities to strike the enemy, but even if the enemy doesn't do any of that, because we're knocking down the enemy like probably every other round, when they stand up, we at the very least are going to be able to strike them if our battle buddy is not a fighter. So it's a really solid one, and again, it really focuses on the use of our weapon. And as a bard using Courageous Anthem, we're actually not that far off from our other martial compatriots when it comes to our attack score, especially because the whole point of this is to flank the enemy, reducing their AC by 2, meaning that, with our buff and with the enemy's reduction in AC, we'd be hitting as a normal martial against an enemy without any buffs or debuffs. So that's actually pretty good, all things considered. It's a very powerful setup, and even before level 10, you can see how a lot of the efficiencies are slowly building up. At level 10, we get Courageous Assault. Courageous Assault is insanely powerful for this spell because now when we're already flanking with our ally in combat and we need to use Courageous Anthem on the second turn, for instance, the ally can use their reaction to strike the enemy, as long as they're benefiting from your Courageous Anthem, which they're going to be, unless the enemy is absolutely massive, in which case you probably shouldn't be flanking at that point. So this is really good, and it benefits you even if you have a fighter. Fighters always like to keep their reaction for whenever the enemy tries to move or use a manipulate action or something like that. but this just prevents the enemy from getting away like at all, because now the fighter just doesn't even need anything to trigger it. They can just use their reaction to strike the enemy. And if the fighter is going a reaction build, they might get another reactive strike anyway. So, this is really good, and it's especially good if you have like a barbarian on your team, because every hit you allow a barbarian to take is going to do massive damage. So Courageous Assault fits into this build really, really well. And we actually need it for a feat later in addition, but the biggest part is we're going to be maintaining our Courageous Anthem anyway. Like, as I said, in our initial setup, when we're moving into position and striking the end or getting ready for the next round, on our second turn, when we're using Courageous Anthem, now our ally just can strike in addition to the fact that we're going to be knocking them down. And speaking about knocking down, the next feat is going to help this even more. At level 12, it gets even better because we get improved knockdown from the Mauler Dedication. Improved knockdown is insanely good for this build, particularly because it means we don't really need to rely on our athletics anymore. All improved knockdown, well, actually, improved knockdown does a couple things. So, first of all, improved knockdown removes the need to actually make a trip action. And that is actually really good because it just prevents us from failing a part of our maneuver, more or less. So, improved knockdown, you hit the enemy with a strike, and if you hit, they are automatically tripped, and they automatically take the effects of a critical trip, which, if you're unaware, when an enemy is critically tripped, they take a d6 damage as they fall to the ground. But with the Mauler Dedication and in this particular feat, we can use our weapon damage instead. And if our weapon is a two-handed finesse weapon, which, there are a few, this allows us to deal our weapon damage instead of the d6, which is more than likely higher, allowing us to do essentially an additional d whatever based on our weapon when we use this maneuver. In addition, you're not using 2 attack actions because you automatically get the effect of a trip. Now, this is something that might be contentious, and I honestly don't know. I've spoken to some people from Paizo about this particular feat, and they're like, whatever you think works. Whatever you think works for your game. So from that interpretation, I'm just going to side with the players on this one. When you use improved knockdown, you also don't suffer additional map because you're not actually making a trip maneuver. You're just getting the effect of a trip automatically. So now if you do any other maneuvers, which you probably don't have the action economy for, but if you do, then you're only going to be at a -5, which is pretty cool. It's a really solid setup. Again, now when we trip the enemy on our second turn here, they just take an additional die of damage and we're good to go. And when they need to stand up, we have our Reflexive Courage to keep them down. And as long as we hit, our Courageous Anthem gets extended so that on the third round of combat, we're set to go with doing whatever. It's a really good build. I thoroughly enjoy this build. And it's a melee bard build. It's so good. And you barely use any spell casting to make it work. I think that's fantastic. Oh yeah, and something I forgot to mention, because I'm sure this is going to come up in the comments down below. If you're a spellcaster, there's actually no requirement if you have a spell that uses the manipulate action that you have a hand free. That's actually not necessary. As long as you're not restrained, you can use somatic components, which got removed in the remaster. So if manipulate actions to gesticulate, even with both your hands full. So the Mauler Dedication does actually not prevent us from casting any spells. I'm sure some people are going to mention that, so hopefully they get this far in the video at the very least to know that, no, yeah, you can use a two-handed melee weapon and still cast spells at the same time. It works just fine. All right, so now at level 14, we get Shared Assaults. Now, Shared Assault is potentially really good, but it only really works if you have additional allies who can benefit from your Anthem and are striking enemies in combat. So what the feat does is when we use Courageous Assault, so on our second round, for instance, then if our ally critically strikes the enemy, which there's a good chance of this, mind you, because not only are you benefiting them with your Courageous Anthem, which is giving them +1, and the enemy should be flat-footed or off guard, sorry. So their AC is reduced by 2. When your ally critically strikes, another ally within your Courageous Anthem, which is a pretty big area, can make a strike as a reaction. Now, if that ally then crits, it doesn't continue. It only goes out to a second ally, and it doesn't even have to be against the same enemy that you're fighting necessarily. So this is really good in a lot of situations. It just capitalizes on a crit, and again, it can potentially give reactive strikes, essentially, to your allies who don't normally have it. So the Vicious Songblade is especially good in a team that has tons of marshals to work around. But even if you have just one marshal to work with, this works perfectly well, but you might want to change out Shared Assault for another feats or something else if you only have one other marshal on your team. But if you have, multiple marshals, this is an insanely powerful feat to pick up. And it capitalizes on what the build already does, which is reduce enemy defenses to make your allies hit and or crit more often, and just allowing them more opportunities to do so. Again, this is such a powerful build. It's baffling to me how good this build is, despite the lack of spellcasting that as a spellcaster you're doing. At level 16, we're picking up Courageous Onslaught, and this just combines Courageous Advance with Courageous Assault to make a more powerful version of the spell shape, essentially. So now, when we use our Courageous Anthem, we can allow an ally to stride and strike. So our first round of combat, as I mentioned before, we use our Courageous Anthem. Our ally can move out and strike the enemy, dealing damage with the one action. And you can do this for other allies in combat as well. This allows you to actually help reposition your team very easily, because at any time you can just use Courageous Anthem and you can move an ally and cause them to strike as a part of a reaction. It's insanely good. You can allow an ally to join you in combat, to do something else in combat. Like, it's really good for repositioning, and it's all just an additional action of Courageous Anthem in addition to our whatever. Now, of course, this is a spell shape, so I kind of flubbed a little bit earlier because I said, on your second turn, you can do Courageous Assault into Courageous Anthem into Knockdown, which you actually can't do. But it does cost an extra action. So on your second round, if you're doing Courageous Onslaught or Courageous Assault, then you only get to do like a strike to continue your combat stuff. But that's not necessarily a big thing, and we can always knock down on our next turn if we so choose, which is probably a good idea anyway. And even if not, even if you don't really need to do this, you can just choose to just do Courageous Anthem into Knockdown, just so that you don't have to worry about it next turn. There's a lot of ways that this can be played, and this build is actually insanely reactive because there's so many different ways that it benefits your team, even if not everything goes perfectly. If you can't flank an enemy, for instance, then you don't need to worry about movement necessarily or using your acrobatics, and you can just do a spell, strike the enemy, knock them down, do all kinds of stuff like that. And, there's just a lot of good ways that with Courageous Onslaught being added to it, you can reposition your allies. It's a very, very, I keep saying it's a good build, but I guarantee you, if you play this, you're going to feel very impactful for every battle. At level 18, we're going to pick up Discordant Voice, and this just enhances our Courageous Anthem even more, because when we use Courageous Anthem, our allies deal an additional D6 of sonic damage, which sonic damage is one of the least just resisted damages in the game. So it's very, very good. There's even some enemies that have a good weakness to sonic damage. So this just allows our team to do extra damage on top of the fact that we're giving them a benefit to their attack and damage. And we are, flanking enemies. It's very good. By level 18, we're a god on the battlefield. We're the ultimate battlefield support, and it's very powerful. Now, level 20, you really can select anything. For this build particularly, I went with Brutal Finish. Now, Brutal Finish is predominantly because it fits into the build actually pretty nicely. It does have the press trait, So that means you cannot use it unless you already have a multi-attack penalty. But on our third round or whenever round we have all our actions to do with whatever, then you can strike, you can knock down, and then you can go into brutal finish to attempt to strike the enemy down. And because improved knockdown reduces our map, this allows us to essentially strike the enemy with our equivalently our second attack action for the round at a pretty good chance to hit. If we do hit, we do 2 additional dice of damage because we're past level 18 by the time we pick this up. And even if we miss, we still do our weapon damage to the enemy. So this just enhances our ability to do melee damage while, having like a singular action at the end of our turn. Like, if there's nothing else you're going to do with it, right? You might as well just do damage, and you might as well just have guaranteed damage. Like, even if you miss, as long as it's not a crit miss, you're going to do at least a weapon die of damage. And in fact, does that increase at the end? No, yeah, 2 weapon die by this point when we pick it up. So yeah, it's a pretty good pickup, but honestly, level 20, you can really do anything. Play however you want to play at this point. You're not many games go to level 20, let alone play level 20 for an extended period of time. So that being the case, Brutal Finish works very well as our level 20 feat for the build. All right, so that's all the feats and the core of the build set up, but we're not done yet. But before we get to the spell recommendations and gear recommendations for the build, this video is sponsored by Eldritch Osiris Games. So real quick, I have an ad read that we're going to look at, and it's a pretty good one. If you want more options for Pathfinder 2nd Edition, definitely check it out from our sponsor here. Today's video is brought to us by Monstrous Beasts, A Guide to Friend Them by Eldritch Osiris Games. This supplement is going to increase the bestial nature and give you all the animal and beast related options you could need for your game. And with Pathfinder 2E's Howl of the Wild coming out soon, this is the perfect supplement for you. But hey, what are you going to get in the supplement? Well, you get a new ancestry to become the carcinorous creature that you are always meant to be, the crab folk, with a whole list of feats all the way up to level 17. And in addition, amazing feats such as Crab Rave here, where you get the ability to learn performance and fascinating performance, as we've all seen that video hundreds and hundreds of times. In addition to just this, we also get a new class, the Metamorph, which is, you can see here by this Animorphs style image here, that you get a whole class completely dedicated just to shapeshifting. If you're already tired of how Druid animal forms don't really seem to live up to the hype that you always wanted it to, well, then the Metamorph is for you. This class, in addition to a whole list of its own unique feats and abilities, also harkens back to one of my favorite subclasses back from original Pathfinder 1E. It was a Ranger subclass that allowed you to take on the various aspects of certain creatures that you were hunting. And this particular class allows us to do the same thing, which is something I'm very, very interested in. In addition, we also have a list of new animal companions, one of my favorite being here, the Star Glider. It is a kind of flying nautilus squid creature that you can take with you for anyone who takes the animal companion feats. It's very, very interesting, really, really cool, all kinds of interesting and amazing animal companions to add to your team for all kinds of fun shenanigans. This supplement not only provides new materials for your Pathfinder 2E game, but in addition, it also provides new variants to new rules, like the Animal Instinct for the Barbarian gains access to the Kruth. In addition, they even added new instincts for various forms, like the Aerial Instinct over here, in addition to like a Dinosaur Instinct and all that kind of stuff. So even more variation for your barbarians if you really want to go down that primal rage route. This supplement also comes with 6 whole archetypes, a 7th if you include the multi-class archetype for the Metamorph, one of them being the animal color here, that we can see that is based on calling and summoning animals from the wild, either in a physical form or spiritual form. So you always have the power of nature and beasts on your side in combat without necessarily needing to upkeep them like with animal companions. And one of my favorite parts of the supplement are the new spells added to the game, many of which allow you to summon additional troops of animal. This is something that I've been feeling they really needed in Pathfinder 2nd Edition this whole time, but the ability to actually summon whole troops of animals with some spells is really cool, and something that would really give you that feeling of summoning a whole army at your whim. It's something that I've been really looking for, and this particular supplement gives us just that. The book even does offer something for GMs, giving you a new list of creatures in a bestiary that is about 10 or so creatures long, so you can add some very interesting and different animals to your campaign, like the Ash Cat here. And I wish I could go over this book, and I could probably make a whole video on this supplement alone. But if you want to see more from Eldritch Osiris Games and look into getting this particular supplement, go ahead and check out the description down below, where we'll have a link to their site where you can pick up the supplement for yourself with all the amazing art and amazing way that the book is set up there. But that's going to be it for me. Let's go ahead and continue on with the video. All right, now that we're back, I'm actually going to give you guys some spell recommendations for the build. I did say that a lot of spell casting is not necessary for the build, but that is not necessarily meaning that spells aren't useful even outside of combat. And a lot of these spells are combat spells that we can cast outside of combat. So first and foremost, I'm going to recommend the use of Mystic Armor. Mystic Armor in particular is really good, and I did mention this earlier. If we want the max AC we can get without the speed reduction, then Mystic Armor is going to be how we're going to do it. Now, some of you might cringe because this would use, I think, an 8th level spell for the max end of Mystic Armor for endgame stuff, which means using an 8th level spell slot, but we're not using our spells in combat mostly anyway. So that's actually not a big deal. And the reason why I really like Mystic Armor for this build is Dex is one of the stats that we're going to be getting to at least a +5. And this is one of the only ways we can get a +5 plus an item bonus to our AC, giving us equivalently the same as heavy armor like plate mail, as long as our Dex is +5. So by the time this build hits level 15, we will be having as high of armor as we possibly can in the build. And we'll get the same item bonuses. And honestly, more than anything, Mystic Armor just allows us to ignore the need to buy really high-end armor for the build. We can do whatever and save a bunch of money for either better weapons or for, whatever you need, more potions, more items. There's a lot of ways that this just saves us a ton of money, and it's until your next daily preparation. So, you just pop the spell in the morning and you're good for the rest of the day. And it's a good build. And honestly, because it's till your next daily preparations, another hidden benefit to Mystic Armor is you essentially get the benefits of Mystic Armor even while you're sleeping, which many characters don't get the same armor benefits in their sleep. So honestly, Mystic Armor is insanely powerful for the build. Another really good spell for the build is Sure Strike. Sure Strike just allows us to, if we have an extra action available, to get advantage on our next strike, which when it comes to something like our improved Knockdown, for instance, it might be important to have that in our pocket. So you spend an action, you get advantage, which means you roll twice, you take the best of two. There's so many good ways that this particular spell can be used in the build, and it's a level 1 spell, and you don't need to heighten it to get any additional benefits. So it's just a really good spell to have in your pocket because it's always good. And when you're getting to late game, it just uses one of your early level spell slots that you're not going to be using a ton anyway. The next spell I'm going to recommend is False Vitality. And this one just helps with one of our biggest weaknesses in the build, which is that we're just kind of squishy. Like with Mystic Armor, we should have a decent AC, and a higher dex will allow us to, not get crit as often, but we don't get the HP. Well, we get 8 HP, which is actually the same as some of the marshals in the game, which isn't bad. It just kind of depends on how much constitution you should be putting in your build, which honestly is whenever you can. So that being the case, False Vitality just gives us a buffer. I mean, if you use the level 2 version, it gives us 10 HP or 10 temp HP, which is going to go a long way. It lasts for 8 hours when you cast it too, so you don't have to worry about casting this in combat. It's a very solid pickup, and it can early game, as soon as we get it, it's like 2 strikes, like a strike and a half of damage negation. Later game, it's like a strike, or it reduces like 80% of a strike. So it heightening it is not also that great because you get 3 temp HP per heightened spell effect, which I don't think is particularly worthwhile. But if you're not planning on using spells in combat anyway, you might as well do whatever you need to get as much HP in your build as possible. Blur is another good one. This one just essentially negates 25, not negates, but it reduces enemy damage by 25% in the fact that you become concealed, meaning the enemy will need to make a DC 5 flat check to even target you. So that being the case, 25% of the time, we're just ignoring an enemy attack, which means that we're essentially reducing enemy damage by 25%. And honestly, it's actually more impactful depending on how much time is going into combat. So Blur's really good. It's a really good in-combat spell if you're in a really bad situation. Now, this one only lasts for a minute, so that's something to keep in mind. You will need to use 2 of your valuable actions to get it off, but it's better than dying. So sometimes just casting Blur instead of proper setup might just be more warranted for you and your team. So that being the case, just a good spell to have on hand. And again, it solves our squishy issue. And also, our last spell is Haste, and this is a no-brainer. Haste is the best boost in the game you can give your team. And when you get to level 7 and you can get to, not level 7, technically when you get to level 13, when you cast 7th rank spells, you can use this on your whole team. So that being the case, giving all your allies an additional action every turn to either strike or stride is insanely powerful. And if you can early game, if you can do this even on just your battle buddy, this will increase their damage even more as well. So these are my spell recommendations, and obviously there's tons and tons of really good spells that the bard has that they can weave into their combat in various situations. These are the ones that either take place outside of combat, so you don't need to worry about your in-combat action economy, or enhance your survivability, or with haste, increases your team's potential to do damage. So that's going to be it for my spell recommendations. Let's go ahead and look at some gear. So my first recommendation is going to be the Trollhound Vest. Now, this one is a level 6 uncommon item, but if you can find it, it helps out a lot. Even though we're going to be using Mystic Armor for a majority of our AC stuff, Mystic Armor actually doesn't prevent us from the use of any magic armors that we're wielding. And the Trollhound Vest is insanely good because when you drop below 50% of your health, as a reaction, you can give yourself 3d8 HP back as you regenerate a little bit from the Trollhound Vest. This can last you pretty much till the end of the game, in all honesty, because we're using Mystic Armor for a majority of our AC purposes. So this one is just, again, an insurance policy to ensure that we don't just die on the field of combat. It's really powerful, very, very good. I thoroughly enjoy this idea behind the build because it allows us to wear whatever armor. So whatever armor that we deem necessary for whatever purposes it has, we don't have to worry about the AC benefits. We don't have to worry about investing in potency runes or even fundamental runes, honestly. But even then, even if you do, you still can get the benefits of those runes because Mystic Armor, all it changes is your AC and your bonus to saves. That's it. So, whatever fundamental runes we put on or whatever potent property runes we put onto our armor, we can still get those benefits. So this allows us to be very flexible with the kind of things that we wear. And honestly, it's one of the strengths of the build, in my opinion. Boots Abounding is another item I'm going to highly recommend. It's a very easy pickup, honestly. It increases our speed, which allows us to more easily get into position, which is a core aspect of the build. And with the benefits to jumping, leaping, whatever, and our athletics being pretty good, Oh yeah, that's something I actually forgot to mention as well, is after we picked up improved knockdown, you can actually retrain some of your athletics out for some of your other skills. As long as you are still trained in athletics, improved knockdown will still work. So if your athletics is master at that point, you can reduce it down to trains, and you're not going to be worse to wear. Though it is good to have on hand just in case, because even though you're using a two-handed weapon, you might choose to take one of your hands off to grapple an enemy instead, if the enemy just has very poor fortitude, for instance. So there are some ways that it can be beneficial, but it's not necessary anymore. Boots of Bounding, it is beneficial because it helps with the high jump and all that kind of stuff like that, and long jump. But other than that, do whatever you feel is better for the build. I would put it into crafting more, because we're actually just about to get into my mutagen and alchemical item recommendations. And these recommendations are predominantly for just extending your character's life on the battlefield. Not really much more to say about it. So what I'm going to recommend is the Juggernaut Mutagen. Gives you temp HP, and it gives you a bonus to your fortitude saves, which is very important, but it does reduce our will, any will checks we make, and perception checks, and initiative. So you do need to be careful while using it. Also, it lasts only a minute up until level, I think, 8. And after that point, it's like 10 minutes and like an hour. The one thing you need to be careful of is if you're taking like the 10-minute or hour versions, you need to understand that you cannot remove this effect if you need to. So that your will is going to be reduced for potentially an hour if you're not careful. It's something that you want to judge on a case-by-case basis, but again, dying as a frontliner is not a good thing. So having as much temp HP available as possible is really good. So if we're not using False Vitality, Juggernaut Mutagen is not a bad pickup. Similarly, the Mistform Elixir can kind of replace Blur. Now, it again similarly lasts for a minute, so you have to use it in combat, but that's the same as Blur. And it can last, I believe, actually, let me check. Yeah, at most it can last 5 minutes, which is not super good, honestly. Like, I would honestly only take the 1 minute version unless you are about to get into a lot of successive battles. And Mistform Elixir, if you're unaware, allows you just become concealed constantly while under the effect. So this just again reduces enemy damage essentially by 25%, which is very good. So another recommendation that again can save you a spell slot, and it's not that expensive. It's 56 gold pieces per, which eventually just is not that big a deal. And even the 3-round version is only 18 gold pieces. So it's one I'm going to highly recommend. Another elixir I'm actually going to recommend is also the Cheetah Elixir. The Cheetah Elixir allows you to move faster with no real downsides to it. It's a very handy one. It can be useful in combat, and there is a 10-minute version you can do, which can be also really handy. And also, the benefit of having these on you is you can give them to your allies as they need them as well. So these are just some items I figure can help out. Oh, actually, I have one more item. The pink Rhomboid Aeon Stone is really good. Now, it is a bit of a later game item, a level 12 item, I believe. But when you pick it up, it gives you 15 temp HP just every day and access to the Stabilize cantrip, which hopefully you won't need to use. Again, more temp HP to use as necessary. You can use this in conjunction with a lot of, your spells, Juggernaut Mutagens, whatever, to ensure your character has a plethora of temp HP to rely on every single day. But these are just my item recommendations. These mostly are just to keep your character alive. But, the finesse two-handed weapon, there's quite a few in the game. I'm not going to necessarily recommend one, but I will say the Bladed Scarf is a pretty fun one, even though it doesn't do that much damage. It does have the trip, so it benefits your knockdown early, which is pretty cool. But a lot of them work pretty easily with the build, honestly. And if Well, I have a special one I'll recommend when we get to the ancestry part of the build. Which, by the way, so let's go ahead and talk about archetypes. So I always highly recommend that if you're playing Pathfinder 2nd Edition, you use the free variant rule of free archetype. It almost everyone does it anyway. It's very powerful, and it just gives you a second set of levels every even level to pick up another feat, specifically from archetypes. Now, this build works really, really well, even with the Mauler stuff in it. So these extra slots, I wouldn't even put your Mauler dedication in because honestly, it fits into your build already. So I have 3 recommendations for archetypes that go really well with how this build works out. My first one's going to be Acrobat. Since we're going to have a higher dex and Acrobatics is one of the skills we're focusing on, one, just picking up this dedication means that we don't need to spend any of our skill increases in Acrobatics, because with the dedication itself, we'll just get to legendary Acrobatics eventually, which is pretty cool. But in addition to that, this adds a bunch of functionality when we do need to or want to tumble through enemies, making it easier to tumble through enemies, allowing us to move faster or further when we tumble through, even allowing us to trip an enemy while we're tumbling through, which means you might want to keep your athletics high if you're going with the Acrobat dedication. So it fits in cleanly with the build. It's a really, really nice one, and it's one I'm going to highly recommend. The next one is going to be the Dread Marshal specifically. So Marshal is really good, but the Inspirational Marshal is not as good with our Courageous Anthem because there's just too much overlap. But the Dread Marshal debilitates enemies instead, which does pair very well with our Courageous Anthem. There's a lot of feats in the Marshal archetype dedication that I think are good, but our build is kind of action intensive, so I don't know when you would use a lot of these. But at the very least, the Dread Marshal aura is very powerful. So, use it as you will. I mean, I would be remiss not to enhance our essential combat abilities through our archetypes. And speaking on that, actually, my third recommendation is going to be the Blessed one. Yeah, this one keeps showing up in a lot of my builds, and it's mostly because if a build doesn't use a lot of its focus points, because like this build uses no focus points, even though we're a bard that can get focus spells, we only really use Courageous Anthem, which is a focus cantrip. So that being the case, we have a bunch of focus points, well, up to 3, that we are not really using. And Blessed One is one of the best ones to do it because now, in addition to being the ultimate battle buddy, we can be the team healer as necessary. We can get the Lay on Hands and Mercy so we can remove afflictions. It fits very nicely into the build, enhances our support capacity, and even further enhances our ability to stay on the battlefield. As just a singular action, you can restore a stupid amount of HP with Lay on Hands. It's insanely good. So that being the case, it's just good. It's just a good pickup. It enhances your combat abilities a lot, gives you another role to perform in your team, and makes use of a resource that otherwise you wouldn't be using. So I don't feel bad about using Blessed One all the time. I think it's just a really good archetype. Fits very neatly into a lot of builds. All right, almost done. I know this is a bit of a longer build. It's just a little bit more intensive when you have spellcasters. But let's go ahead and get to my ancestry / heritage recommendations. And my first ancestry recommendation is going to be Elf. And the main reason why I recommend Elf is mostly just the Elven Curve Blade. It's just a larger scimitar. It's a good finesse 2-handed weapon that deals a D8 damage, which honestly, for 2-handed finesse weapons, that's a little on the rare side. So it's really good to have a good solid damage option. And it's forceful. So if you do want to go more into the melee aspect, if you just want to do some hits, if you're dealing with a bunch of mook enemies, well, not mook enemies, well, maybe mook enemies, if you're not killing them in one blow anyway, the forceful trait can come really in handy. It's just a really good finesse weapon, one I highly recommend. Plus, Elf really fits in neatly because you can get a buff to your speed if you want to. Has a lot of really good heritages. And, overall, I love the idea of the Elven Songblade anyway. So the vicious Elven Songblade with an Elven Curve Blade is really good. And speaking on heritages, actually, the heritage I'm going to recommend is Sylph. I know their names got changed, but for the life of me, I've been struggling to find the name for the new ancestry changes. So I'm going to put Sylph here, but it's the air elemental bloodline. If, you know, for when the remaster stuff on it comes out, because well, again, it has a lot of the same properties of Elf. If you're playing a different ancestry, Sylph can provide you with speed. Also, Smoke Soul is one of my favorites in this regard because Smoke Soul actually can be used in tandem with the Mistform Elixir, giving you a reaction to essentially make the enemy have a 10% higher chance of missing you while concealed by your mist from Mistform. So that being the case, it works really, really well with Mistform Elixir. I think personally it benefits the build very well. And like I said, Sylph just gives you a lot of good mobility options to allow you to position better for your team. But that's it. That is the Vicious Songblade. You are the ultimate battle buddy. You enhance your team, have martial capabilities, and on top of all this, you're still a full spellcaster. You can use a lot of your spells outside of combat for exploration purposes, or if necessary, in combat when a situation comes up, allowing you to take a lot more niche spells since you don't need to really rely on them for damage or effectiveness in combat. I personally really like this build. There's a lot of people out there who might not because you're being a fake Marshal in a sense. But like I said, while you're flanking and while your Courageous Anthem is going on, you're essentially hitting the same as a Marshal would if they were going mano-a-mano with an enemy. So there's really no reason why you shouldn't be doing this and simultaneously boosting everyone on your team, enhancing their damage, and also debuffing the enemies. It's a very powerful build, and this is actually a really good starter build as well. So if you have someone who's new to the game and wants to kind of step into spellcasting but likes the Gish kind of playstyle, I'd recommend this build to them. And in fact, like the video so that other people have a chance to see the video. And if you want to get more builds for Pathfinder 2nd Edition, then go ahead and subscribe as I try to get a build out every week. I'm going to get 2 out this week because I missed this video last week due to a recording error. So, if you like all things tabletop, this is the place to be. But that's going to be it for me. This video is way too long. Thank you all so much for watching. Good luck with your games. Leave the bad luck to me, and I'll see you all next time. Bye.